Good afternoon, good morning, folks. I'm BK from the Pennsylvania Park Maintenance Institute. I want to thank you all for joining us today as we investigate a little bit of asset management. So, asset management is not a topic confined to manufacturing, transportation, or financial industries. There is a need for parks and recreation professionals to have a deep understanding of what processes and management tools they need to apply a portfolio of built and natural assets. So, what is asset management? How can parks and recreation organizations apply it to improve lasting performance? This webinar will cut through the jargon to provide some practical understanding of the tools and many industries and organizations apply and why. So for this shop talk, we have invited Chris Silkie, who's a program manager in asset management from Portland Parks and Recreation, to share his expertise working within multiple industries and explain how to apply it to parks. So we're going to learn a little bit of gain an understanding of why organizations pursue asset management. Learn some of the technical tools that are used for part of this practice and identify the steps within your organization should you want to advance your practice of asset management. Before starting with Portland Parks and Recreation 5 years ago, Chris worked in consulting related to asset management and sustainability for numerous federal, municipal, and state clientele on projects related to organizational change, infrastructure, financial analysis, and forecasting, and using data to inform asset investment decisions workflows. He also served in the U.S. Coast Guard and the Foreign Service Officer in the State Department. Now indoctrinated Parky, Chris also participates in several local and national committees working to advance the cause of asset management. So I'm going to hand it off to Chris.
Great, thank you, BK. Just a quick audio check if you could nod, confirm that you can hear me. Great, thank you. So, first, before we start into these questions, why do asset management? What is it? And how do you do asset management? I would just like to ask everyone to think for a minute. How many of you are practicing asset management right now? And you don't need to raise your hand virtually or nod your head. Just think about it for a minute. And the answer is all of you probably are. And a lot of the practices of asset management are things that well-run organizations do anyway. What's different is we're adding a comprehensiveness and a structured, systematic approach to many of those facets. So today we're going to cover why do it, why do we care, what is it that we're talking about, and how. And there's probably people here on this webinar that could be teaching this as well. So I also hope to learn something today, and I hope to have a dialogue. And I've selected content to kind of hit all different levels of asset management. So hopefully there's something for everyone to take away and maybe something to contribute.
A piece of art that she made of her mom. So look, she started doing the polka dots on top.
Right. And the piece of art behind me was made by my 10-year-old. So, all right. So why do we care about asset management? This is from about 15 years ago in a town in Australia, and it's a road that washed out. There was a culvert underneath that had scoured, and during a rainstorm late at night, it blew out, and then the landslide happened and the road washed out. The family that you see pictured drove over the edge and they all perished. And in the investigation that followed, it turned out that the city council knew about the culvert. They knew that the culvert was eroded and corroded and had issues. Not only did they know about it, they had actually gone out and gotten bids years before this tragedy to get it replaced and get the road stabilized. And it turned out that they did not have a systematic approach to elevating these risks so that they could be addressed in a timely manner. So reduction of the grave risks is one of the reasons why organizations practice asset management. And it's not just confined to the built environment, of course. Another reason is actually advancing our equity objectives. What you see here is a picture of a playground before and after from a targeted investment. Well, originally, before we took a comprehensive approach to looking at our entire playground system, this one wasn't prioritized for investment, but because we were able to look at the entire system as a whole and then say, well, where are we going to focus our investments? We were able to elevate the priority. So one of the groups I sit on, a gentleman has a phrase. He says, you know, it took a structured and systematic approach to get us into this hole that we're in as far as equity and racism in the United States. And it's going to take a structured approach to get us out of that hole. And asset management is the ally of equity and anti-racism in that regard when it comes to infrastructure. Another why is forecasting. So the red line is a depiction of deferred maintenance forecasted with a very high degree of confidence. And then the green line shows what can happen through a series of bonds and other resource infusions. Like we can show exactly how much is needed to bring this down and in what time frame makes sense for the organization. And then for us in Portland, there's actually a policy that says you have to maintain an inventory, forecast the needs and costs. And then this is the key right here. Provide infrastructure at the lowest life cycle costs, which meets service requirements. So in some organizations, there's a policy. So now about the what. What is this about? So really we're talking about taking care of assets for the long term. You know, these pictures are taken 100 years apart. So what does the next 100 years bring for your organization? So first, let's just go through what it's not. It's not just built infrastructure, not just a work order system. We're not talking about condition assessment only, not just maintenance management, and it's not just one person's job. There's no way one person could do everything, nor should they. So here's the textbook definition. Asset management is the coordinated activity of an organization to realize value from assets. So that's a pretty vague definition. I don't know if you could launch into a program just based on that alone. So I'm going to propose 3 questions and see if you can answer these for your organization. And these are foundational elements of asset management. Being able to answer confidently and comprehensively, what do I own? What is required? And how do I close the gap between the two? And there's many different ways to close the gap between those two. So what do I own? What is required? How do I close the gap? So it was going to be jargon free. I'm going to throw out some jargon on the next slide. These organizations on the left actually publish standards on asset management. The International Standards Organization, ISO 55000, is kind of the standard for asset management. The Institute of Asset Management also has some frameworks and standards out there. ASTM has one as well, as does IPWEA, the Institute of Public Works Engineering in Australasia. Remember that one? They got a little like, it's kind of like the Space Force symbol. We're going to come back to them. And then on the right is, that's how we've defined it in Portland. And I think it kind of adds some meat to these definitions, focusing on sustainable service levels, investment decision support, lifecycle management, information management, and then culture and communications. Okay. So the what, focusing on those 3 questions. And now for the how. Well, obviously it takes a team. I'm just going to point out some positions just to give you an idea. the person on the far left and the far right, so Kiori's on the far left, she manages our work order analysis, and for like 30,000 work orders a year, and helps provide dashboards and reports about where spending has happened, is where it should happen, where are the gaps. Faiz on the far right, he actually maintains this database of these hundreds of thousands of data points and deficiencies throughout our system. So he both maintains the data and goes out and actually collects information about the condition of assets. So remember, we had 3 questions. What do I own? What's required? How do I close the gap? And then I'm going to kind of fold over that 3 pillars of continuous improvement, informed decisions, and organizational alignment. And then we're going to zoom in on the informed decisions. This is probably where many have had some experience with asset management in the past. So this is a generic depiction of the life cycle of an asset. You have early life, midlife, and late life. And so one of the key pillars is making informed decisions by where in this life cycle is my current infrastructure. And it can be at very, very detailed level, or it can be at a very high level. So are we talking about a whole playground, or are we talking about just a piece of play equipment? So both facets need to be considered. And this is a key part of asset management. And so by being able to do that at the micro level and then aggregate it up to the macro level, you're able to make whole portfolio informed decisions. So how do you grade it? How do you determine where in the life cycle a particular asset may be? Well, I copy standards from others who've thought through this before. Is how I do it. And so I'm just giving you one example. That IPWEA publishes a standard on pathways, and we leveraged that and adapted it to our local environment, and following these ratings from very good through very poor. And then behind each one of these ratings, there's a bunch of criteria, maybe 20 or 30 different assessment points. Next, how do you create the assessment protocol? You start with the objectives. What are you trying to do? Scope. For us, it was about 300 miles of pathways for just our pathway assessment. Find the standards, develop the checklist, program into electronic tools, calibrate. And so what I mean by calibrate is making sure that everyone who's involved is interpreting the standards the same way, and then between each other, they're assessing assets the same way as best as possible. Collect all the data and then conduct cross checks to make sure that, yep, we're still doing it the same way. And then you end up with the high quality data. And another output is, remember, what do you own? In doing that, you can say, wait a minute, this segment of pathway is not in our system. Well, who does it belong to? Does it actually belong to us? And then you start asking those questions and researching those things, and you can identify, what do I own, as well as what do I not own, and then tee up those conversations. So it's part of answering, what do I own? You can forecast trends. What you see here is we've done playground assessments twice in this comprehensive manner, in 2016 and in 2020. And what's interesting is we've had a tremendous investment between those 2 assessments, yet, and you can see the taller blue bar at the far left. So we have lots of new stuff because we had all these investments. However, what we know is that overall, the whole portfolio has still shifted to the right, and the average condition is still worse than it was when we started that series of investments. And so we're able to use that to forecast, hey, despite these considerable amount of investments, it is inadequate to prevent that decline for the portfolio, and we are not on a sustainable trajectory. So adjustments need to be made. So what do I own? What's required? How do I close the gap? And we can display things geographically. This is just showing a map of the results of our pathways assessment, and dark red obviously has more issues, and we're just able to display things in a clear and convincing way to decision makers when we're saying, hey, we need to invest in this red dot right here. And it becomes pretty evident that it is an area in need of investment. So that's just an example of some of the displays that become useful. And you can zoom in too. So at a given park, what are the assets and the relative condition of a specific park, whether it's a pathway, a playground, basketball court, sidewalk, and so on. So I'm showing one of our parks, and we're actually programming considerable investment on some of these red splotches. So hopefully they'll be green in just a couple of years when all those projects are done. So, but this was used to build the business case to bring the targeted investment. So this is about the informed decision making. And remember, the other pillar was continuous improvement. And I'm just going to talk about processes a little bit. So remember, asset management isn't just maintenance management or just condition assessment. You have to talk about processes. And what I'm showing is a result of some benchmarking that looked at these different facets. So working along the bottom, the organizational considerations, your organizational structure, your information systems, the various processes and practices, the data housed within those information systems, people considerations such as training, that sort of thing, and job responsibilities. And then asset management plans, which is a concept where you kind of tie it all together for a specific category of asset. And then on the left is how mature are your processes in that regard. So, it starts out, hey, we don't have anything documented, we just do things. And then more mature would be it's documented and we follow it. And then even more mature would be it's documented, we follow it, and we continuously improve upon it. So there's a structured process of reviewing your various policies and practices, refining them, and improving upon them. And I'll just zoom in on one example of this. For a second. So this is a high-level flow chart. If you start at the green system assessments, you could start at the far left, operations and maintenance, work your way around clockwise. You document needs, again, their current and future needs, because once you know where you are in that life cycle, you can project into the future. Where am I going to be 5 years from now? And then you either accept the risk and start and essentially add to your backlog. Hopefully you're mitigating the risk, not just accepting it, or you can start doing something about the risk that has been uncovered and move into project feasibility and selection, into the project to address the issue, and then through asset handover and completion and back to operations and maintenance and so on. So this is kind of a high-level cycle. And the one aspect of this that kind of didn't exist for a long time, and we've added formally into our process. I should say it existed, but it was in the ad hoc category, and we've since formalized it, is this project feasibility and selection, where we actually formalize the need for alternatives analysis and feasibility. And so I'll talk through one example of that. I'm not hearing questions, Brian. Are there any in the chat or any that we should pause and address?
No questions as of yet, but if you're going to dig a little deeper into that feasibility, I definitely think that is something to expand upon. as well as, is this something that you're doing completely internally, or is this something where you seek out, outside consultants to get involved in certain phases, or maybe you can expand upon some of those things?
Yeah, I sure will. Thank you. And actually, you teed up my next slide. So this is fun. Well, it's a busy slide. Don't try to read any of it. There's no need to read it. Just look at the great pictures. So on the left is some of our park pathway lighting before a project, and on the right is after. And so as with any exterior lighting project, you have so many stakeholders, from a safety perspective. Hey, light everything up, light it up, and keep it on 24/7, and we want to see everything all the time. From an ecological health perspective, make sure there's no uplighting, try to keep the lights off as much as possible, try to keep things in their natural state as much as possible. And then from a maintenance and energy efficiency standpoint, we want accessible, maintainable, standardized, efficient lighting. And so this is where I'm talking about the alternatives analysis. And then of course, cost or budget is a constraint. So this was a relighting project. We converted our pathway lighting to LEDs and went through alternatives analysis in a couple different ways. So the first way was just the general scope of the project. If we could completely redo the lighting design for a park, we could probably come up with a better design. That would mean new poles, that would mean new electrical distribution, all of it. And you're probably talking several $100,000 per park to do something like that. On the other end of the spectrum, if we just replace the luminaires with LEDs, the bulbs themselves. Actually, there are retrofit kits where you can just essentially, many of us have probably done them in our home, where you just unscrew the bulb and screw them a new LED, and they last years. 10 years is not uncommon, and 1/10 of the energy consumption. So that's kind of the other end of the spectrum. We could probably do a whole park for probably less than $10,000 to just do that kind of just essentially bulb replacement. Maybe that's optimistic. Well, the downside of that is that we're not able to hit any of those environmental benefits. So we're not able to eliminate uplighting. And so that was one of our key objectives in this. So where we landed was in the middle, where we replaced the whole fixture in order to kind of thread the needle and eliminate uplighting, get all the benefits of LEDs, and not cost an exorbitant amount. So we were actually able to do 7 parks for the same budget that otherwise would have cost for 1 park. And so that's what I mean by alternatives analysis, just working through the costs and benefits of all those different scoping alternatives. And then you can actually get into the micro alternatives analysis with the very specific fixture that you're choosing itself, and what actually makes sense. So that's kind of there's the scoping alternatives analysis, and then there's the very specific. And one of the questions we wanted to answer was, does it make sense to install a control system as well? And so what we did, this was with the help of a consultant who actually put the dollars and cents together for us. They looked at the labor cost of dispatching when there's an outage, the disruption when there's an outage, when we don't know about it, as well as the maintenance and so on. And so by looking at all those dollars and cents, we were able to say, hey, yeah, going to this retrofit, going to a basic but remote control system, so not just local controls, it's an internet-based system. It actually does make sense from a dollars and cents perspective, because we're considering operational costs. And oftentimes there's a tendency to just look at those first costs of a capital project. Well, then this went one step further, and we actually looked at the ecological impact of going to that no uplighting, and using a bunch of assumptions were actually to make the case to our city budget office to say, hey, actually, this makes sense from a total public value perspective to invest in this project citywide. And our city budget office concurred with that evaluation. Unfortunately, the COVID-induced recession kind of swept away all the funding that was going to go for that, but there'll be another round, once we rebound from that as well. But they did recommend the investment, and so I think it was a successful business case in that regard. So that's the feasibility alternatives analysis and quantifying it so you can build the business case, both for the investment itself, as well as which specific investment makes the most sense. All right. So back to the pillars: continuous improvement, informed decision-making, and organizational alignment. And I'm going to build on that a little bit here. Okay. It's a birthday cake or a graduation cake. When we graduate, we'll blow out the candles and then we go away. So the way to read this is from left to right, from bottom to top, and kind of a cycle. So, starting with the foundation, that first layer of the birthday cake, what do you own? Then what's required, and how do you close the gap? And then I've kind of broken those up into inventory and assessment to help answer what do you own, what's required, and it's not just the quantity. It's really important to also answer the quality. Should every playground be a fully inclusive playground, as we use that phrase, or is ADA compliance the standard that we're looking for? Or do we want to go beyond those minimums? So that's an example of quality. And then again, for natural areas, ecological health is an important measure of quality. So the aggregate number, the distribution, how good is it? Where is it? And then how do you close the gap? The management plan and the funding plan. So how are you going to actually manage that category of infrastructure? Who does what? What do they do? When do they do it? And then how do you pay for it? Those are the two elements of that. How do you close the gap? So that's kind of the foundational work. And really it's, well, how does that become operationalized? And that's where every organization needs to get into their unique workflows about budgeting and spending, work orders, and projects. So translating from those management plans to those different decision points. And then alignment comes in when you have the aligned portfolio for operational and capital expenditures linked with performance management. So it's a very long-term proposition. And, in some of my consulting work, one federal agency, I'll say, took 12 years from initiation of saying, hey, we're going to embark on an asset management approach, to really getting to the point of where they had aligned portfolio management linked to performance management, and at an initial level, so not even at a highly mature level. So that kind of journey, that 10-year, 12-year journey, is not unusual. And I'll give you an example of why it's worth it. Is by making this business case, they were able to use all this information, talk about their processes, and get a 30% increase in their appropriations for taking care of a particular category of infrastructure. And it became the model for other federal agencies to use. So those kinds of results aren't unusual, but more importantly than just the resources, we tend to focus on the resources a lot. They actually figured out that they were applying an incorrect escalation factor and got that corrected in policy so that they could set themselves up for the future. And so it was a very small policy change, but they were able to identify that, hey, if we're just going to continue to dig the hole if we don't make this policy change and apply the right escalation factor to our budget to account for construction cost increases instead of looking at a consumer price increase and so on. So looking at escalation and those sorts of things. And that gets at the processes.
Now, on that foundation, do you find, is there a best practice where you take small bites of it and you do, you know, department by department, or is it a better approach to kind of have all departments go at it at once and then see where they're at, and so that way you stay consistent along those ways?
Yeah, so in my experience, it kind of depends on where you are in the organization. You know, if there's a director on this call, say, hey, do all of it, right? You know, allocate all the resources and really lean into it. If you're the champion, let's say in the middle of your organization, you kind of need those small wins to stimulate support for the future and increasing investment. And in my experience, actually, another pitfall is doing it in isolation. So that's the other thing, is thinking that, you know, oh, if I go do all this analysis and go do everything myself and write up this great report, that's going to convince anyone to continue a program and continue the investment. The approach has to be collaborative. And this is just strategies for organizational change. You know, it's not necessarily specific to asset management. I've actually seen where organizations have effectively eliminated a program because the way it was run, it was taking too long to get meaningful, tangible results. So that's a mistake also. So yeah, there's ways. Okay, extra credit to anyone who recognizes the screen there. Gen Xers probably.
I didn't know Pitfall Harry had a mullet.
Right. Right. So, you know, some of the pitfalls to avoid in embarking on a program are chasing details of information that aren't relevant to decision making. And because every little bit of information that is collected and maintained has a cost to it. And it's not just a cost to go out and collect it on the iPad, it's the cost to make sure it stays up to date. It's the electrons, it's the time of the person, and so on. And so if the piece of information is not relevant to the expected decision, then don't collect it. And that's a pitfall, is to say, oh, wouldn't it be neat if, and anytime a conversation starts with, wouldn't it be neat if, it shouldn't be dismissed. It should be listened to and considered, but be cautious about that. So like, wouldn't it be neat if we could say what color all of our swings were? Well, yeah, that'd be neat. I'm not sure that means we should have color as one of the fields that we collect when we go in the field. So whereas manufacturer is probably a more important data point to collect. And I'll give an example of that. When we did our system-wide pathways assessment, tree root intrusion into the pathway, we were debating. It's like, oh, well, we're really concerned with just the pathway, not the nearby trees. But obviously, if there's tree roots present, if you fix it, your pathway is just going to get lifted in a few more years if you don't address it holistically or look at a realignment or so on. Maybe that's okay. But so we actually collected information about nearby tree roots when we did the pathways assessment. So kind of took the blinders off the pathways and also included nearby trees. So that wasn't a fun fact in my opinion. but something else might be, like the presence of trash might be a quote fun fact, because that's a fleeting issue. It could be addressed that same day and you might not even know it. Sometimes it's important, sometimes it's not. We did collect information on graffiti and vandalism when we did playgrounds, because even though we knew it would be outdated, you know, literally the minute we were done, we wanted to get that snapshot of how prevalent is graffiti and vandalism on our playground system, and we were able to do that. So taking too long. Oops, sorry. How do I go back? There we go. Wait. There we go. Taking too long. As we said before, it's an investment. You know, whether it's a committee or several champions meeting once a month to get smart on these issues and devise a plan on these issues, those are still resources that someone's going to be demanding on the time to do something else with. So being able to generate top level support for the investment, the whole investment. So the position, you know, as BK mentioned, you know, I've been in this position for about 5 years. It didn't exist as a full-time position before I filled it. And the way Portland Parks and Rec started was with committees and with collateral duties, and kind of went through that evolution for many years before it came to a point of, hey, we actually need some full-time positions focused on this practice. So that's kind of a typical evolution. It doesn't need to be that way. You know, if the support is generated for the positions or the consulting dollars or something in a surge, you know, definitely take it. It can be challenging. There is a cost and delay though. So there is a cost in going too slow. So another pitfall is, you know, sometimes you go through assessments or you look at processes and they might not be quote yours, and someone else might be the owner of them. And if you compare, you know, this list of asset management best practices to what may be in play in an organization, there will be some differences. And it's not intended to blame anyone or to say that anyone's not doing a good job. And so it's important to have buy-in and that collaborative approach, and start with the assumption that everyone is doing the best they can, and everyone is the expert in their field. And what we're doing is just applying this international standard, you know, this international framework to see where we are and where we might want to change things. And we don't have to adopt all of it. We can pick and choose. We can, you know, discuss what makes sense and not try to just like shove it through, because that doesn't work either, and that gets to blame. And then don't make it up. You know, there's a lot of resources out there. This is not a new practice area. It's been around for over 20 years. It's relatively new to the United States relative to other countries. And then Parks and Rec as an industry is not as mature in its practice of asset management compared to, say, the utilities. So there's no reason to struggle and say, gosh, I don't know how to, you know, what we're talking about or how to do these things. There's lots of resources out there. So don't make it up. And I think, yeah, and I'll show some resources in just a minute, some very practical ones, kind of getting through the acronym soup, rather than you having to read the 2,000 pages of all those different standards and pick and choose. I've kind of curated a little selection that might be of interest to you. So what might be next for you? Again, some people on this webinar, you might be in an organization that is practicing asset management in a very mature way, and every organization is going to be different. So this is just a suggestion. Research a little more. You know, maybe look up some of the standards that I'm going to show you. Think about how they might apply to your organization and your practice. Find like-minded individuals who might also be interested in change. And that might be your boss, it might be a coworker. I strongly suggest against trying to do it alone. And even if it's just one other person, a great person to recruit is your financial manager or financial analyst. These practices and concepts should ring true to them. And there's an organization called the Government Finance Officers Association, and they actually publish articles and I don't think they publish standards, but they have dialogues about asset management too, because it's viewed as a long-term financial issue. And so potentially the finance side might be a good ally for asset management. Think through what your next investment opportunity might be. Is it a budget cycle, just an annual budget cycle? Is it a bond? And anything like that. And try to understand how your organization is currently going to decide what you're going to invest in, what it'll be. Is it the squeaky wheel? Is it, whoever is in the room and best advocates for their issue? Is that where the investment goes? Or can you be more systematic? Can you say, hey, can we look at the whole or more of the portfolio and consider everything? And that's where the equity considerations can really come in to get away from the squeaky wheel and move towards a holistic approach. So this is just a suggestion. I'd certainly be interested in hearing other ideas from anyone else on the webinar about getting started or advancing their program in asset management. Oh, there is a chat going. Let's see.
That's me jumping in there.
Oh, that's
trying
you. Okay.
trying to stimulate some conversation.
Oh, I do see one. Is it possible to get a copy of the program charter? Yes. Maybe BK, if I send references to you, would you be able to share? Is that an easy way to do it?
Absolutely.
And let's see.
So there's a question that did pop up. How closely tied to budget is asset management planning? In other words, is the plan considered when determining money allocated for maintenance budget from year to year?
Yeah, it's a great question, and ideally they're linked, right? And actually, one of the citywide groups I'm working on, we're revising the citywide asset management policy, and this exact question is showing up. Is linking it to budget. In Parks and Rec, the assessment program findings are linked 100% to the next year's budget investment decisions. So it's the starting point. And that doesn't mean it's the ending point, but it's the starting point. And that's from what project gets done perspective, as well as building the case to get more resources so that you can actually do more work. So you don't want to follow the data without considering other factors, but it's good to have it as the starting point. So because you're not accounting for everything, we're not accounting for, oh, they're going to repave this road over here, even though it didn't show up in our data as the #1 priority. Well, maybe we want to seize the opportunity and jump into that project too and do something over there. So you don't want to follow the data dogmatically. It's a great starting point.
And along with those starting points, there was a great question on there for documenting and, what are some of the best tools available out there? Just pen and paper, Excel spreadsheets, software systems. Where do you recommend people start?
Yeah, for us, an organization our size, we're a decent sized park system. We have a pretty good practice in GIS. So we use GIS for most of it. One of the resources I'm going to show you on the next slide actually has a fantastic, easy to follow Excel template that you could print out and write it if you wanted to, and then transcribe it back at the office or on a tablet PC, maybe fill it out directly electronically in the field. There are big, massive software programs that claim to have all of these factors incorporated in it. And, I'd say evaluate your alternatives and see if it meets your needs and move forward accordingly. I will say that the software, the off-the-shelf software has come a long way in the last 10 years even. A lot of them used to just be work order systems, and they would focus on just like, oh, how many hours did you spend, fixing the thing? And some of them have incorporated this life cycle grading in them to varying degrees. And so it's worth looking at. Those can be big implementations, multi-year, take a long time, and so on. So it's definitely worth looking at. Don't let it stop you though. Like, you don't need that big software, depending on the size of your organization.
Some people are starting to jump in with some solutions that Dude Solutions is one that I have seen, and Cartograph is another one of those great examples, depending on the level of packages you do too, because they have all these add-ons and bridges and things. And as you start going down that rabbit hole, that could be an entire webinar in itself, just talking about these different implementations.
I think that's right. Yeah, Dude Solutions, Cartograph, I know is tightly integrated with GIS, so that's helpful. Again, if you're looking at 20 parks, an Excel spreadsheet might be just fine. Might be completely, and then even for mapping, there's some free mapping like Google Earth, or where you just punch in the address. It'll plant the little pinpoints where your things are, and so there's some free mapping software out there if you want to map it.
And that was a great question here. If you're a very small, organization, or if you're just starting completely from scratch, is this something that you could do out of a book, or do you recommend getting an outside consultant to help you really get these going? Or can you just reach out to another aspect of your locality, like Public Works, or what do you recommend in those kind of situations?
Yeah, let's move ahead. Thanks for the tee up. That's a great slide. So I need to click over here. There we go. So I've tried to curate 4 references for you. Again, ISO 55000 is the standard. However, if your organization isn't embracing ISO and other aspects of your organization, like ISO 9000 for quality, ISO 14001 for environmental management, it's probably not going to make a lot of sense initially. So I would actually postpone that till later. So let me talk through these resources, and then there might be some more questions. So in the far left, the Australians, this is where it started. It all started in Australia in the 80s. And they do have some parks specific asset management publications. And they're the only ones out there that I know of that have parks specific asset management publications. And so a great place to start is practice note 10.1. And I'd recommend getting the hard copy. You'll wait a couple weeks for it, and they're pricey, a couple $100 for this thin little book. But that beats, $20,000 for a consultant. So, and they're pretty easy to read, and they have color pictures. so it's a great place to start. Then next, on the right at the top, boy, Canada has they've passed policies and are mandating asset management for all their municipalities. They've linked it to budget in the sense that you cannot get their province level resources unless a municipality has an asset management program and an asset management plan. And they've coupled it with comprehensive nationwide training on asset management. So way far ahead of us in the States. So I tried out this search term, and so it should work in Ecosia or whatever search engine you want to use. Thank you, Alberta government. They put some great tools up there. So just do a search for Open Alberta Municipal Asset Management Toolkit, and you'll get that Excel file as well as just some practical guides about asset management in general, focused on the municipal level. So that's another good resource. And then the EPA has been effectively mandating this for water and wastewater utilities for like 20 years as well. So your local water utility probably has some expertise. Again, you'd have to adapt it, but again, if you're questioning how, it's not a bad starting point. And odds are that there is someone in the water utility who has, you know, some information about the practice of asset management. And then, of course, feel free to reach out to me as well. And you know, I'll share some of the tools that we talked about with BK, and then he can share them with the group. But I've connected with, I don't know, 5 or 10 different parks organizations, and have shared tools, and I think it'd be great to foster a community of practice around this in Parks and Rec. We don't have a central regulator who's saying, do it, you know, everybody's got to do this. Again, water, wastewater, they've had that for a long time, and they're kind of in the optimization phase. Transportation as an industry is starting to become mandated. It's being linked to grants. And so they're having to come up with these transportation asset management plans, and it's basically becoming a requirement for transportation. And in some ways, we're competing with these entities for public dollars. So we in Parks and Rec kind of need to up our game a little bit if we want to compete successfully for these dollars. So that's the end of the formal presentation, but I'd welcome continued Q&A.
Now, I come from higher education background before I found myself back into recreation. You also, I highly recommend reaching out to any of the local universities in your areas and things on their facility side of the house, or as you said, on the purchasing side of the house, because they're implementing a lot of these kind of processes because they're fighting for funding as well. And so this is becoming a common practice across industries, and you'd be amazed at how many collaborations you can pull together, because a lot of us are feeling the same pains, if you will. Now, you've come across multiple industries as well. So do you find that the experiences you've pulled from those various industries play well into the Parks and Rec, or did you have to change your mindset when you found yourself in Parks and Recreation?
Completely changed my mindset. Yeah. I mean, in some ways, it's all the same. It's all stuff, right? We're talking about physical stuff, and so you know that chart of the life cycle, like that all still holds true. That's all just, you know, physics, biology, chemistry, like those all hold true. Just a quick story about that. I did do a training once at the Northwest Resource Management School, and it was a mix of participants, probably a third from Canadian municipalities and then 2/3 from Northwest US. And we talked a little bit about asset management, and I gave an intro and had one of those questions like, oh, okay, so who's done this, or who essentially knows what I'm talking about? And then I looked over where people from Canada were sitting, and like everyone's like, oh yeah, yep, you know, we get it. And then from the US, it was like, so, you know, I on the fly had to dial back to, you know, kind of a more basic discussion about asset management. And so I think that level of funding has been an adjustment in general. I think from what I've seen, the get it done approach and make it work, and the creativity and innovation around funding itself is a cultural trait in Parks and Rec, and some of the more engineering disciplines have been applying those quantitative methods for longer in general. This is a generalization, and so that's why focusing on the human element and finding a collaborative partner and making the case that, hey, how do we know we're not unintentionally neglecting something over there and perpetuating a disparity in our infrastructure? Those kinds of discussions can really help in the Parks and Rec industry, as well as how do we know that we can afford this in the long term? Like those kinds of discussions help, or asking the questions, hey, have we ever been surprised? Like, did something ever break, or we had a financial impact that we weren't ready for? Well, you can avoid that. You can avoid that by practicing these tools.
Well, and that leads great into a question that just popped in there, kind of thinking on the capital replacement side of asset management. And where would you recommend that folks look for life cycles and lifespans of different types of resources? Do those publications that you have those kind of datas in there, or do we just look at manufacturers and those kind of things?
Yeah, one of these IPWEA practice notes does have some example lists. It's not the 10.1, it might be 10.2 or 3 or something like that. So it's got a different title, but they're in there in terms of ranges. And we've compiled some for ours. There's a lot of variability, and I say again, this is another difference with other industries, is there's a lot of variability in the industry, and then local conditions and practices matter a great deal. So even in the water utilities, again, they're very far advanced, they'll take these national and standardized life cycles, and they'll start developing their own for their unique organization and their unique application. So over the course of years, you start developing, well, we actually use 15-year replacement cycle, and that's what we're budgeted for, and that's what we found makes sense. And then there should be a discussion at some point, oh, well, can we actually, materials are getting better, can we extend that to 20 years and reduce the life cycle cost? And so inevitably every organization needs to have their own list, but there's definitely references to start from, and I would start with the IPWEA.
And that makes a very great point too. Sometimes you get some of that advice from the boots on the ground, focusing back on bringing it back to your maintenance professionals, and they know best how long things keep up. If you have a weed eater and you say a weed eater lasts 10 years, but you use it every single day, the life cycle of that weed eater may only be 2 to 3 years, versus somebody that has it in the back of the truck most of the time. Sure, it lasts 10 years. And so the variability can also be found by the folks within your own organization, that sometimes maybe their viewpoint gets neglected from time to time.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, and I don't know if you're on the call, if you're a maintenance professional or a professional tradesperson, if they're not in that group, that initial group, they should be. So, if it's like you and a finance person and, maybe a shop lead or something like that, that's a great combination for like an initial exploration of asset management, get that, practical experience and so on.
Maybe as a final question, because we are coming close to the end of our time here, is there not like a dream team in a sense, but is there a way of creating more buy-in for a holistic team, more so than a top-down push it into the bag approach?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it does come down to relationships to a degree, and I will say that there are aspects of this that are, say, completely within the realm of maintenance decision making. So remember that slide where I said, hey, it's not just this. Well, there are aspects that are maintenance decision making. And so if that's your span of control, I can pretty much guarantee that for everyone on this call, there is something within your span of control that has a best practice established in asset management. And I would suggest grabbing onto that and using that as kind of your inroad into the bigger discipline and saying, hey, you know, they talked about this thing called reliability centered maintenance and in here, and you know, we're going to grab that. Or your project manager and, hey, you know, we really should look at the different alternatives to approaching this kind of project and really cost out the benefits and costs, not just from the quote value engineering, that the way that term is used often just means scope cutting and cost cutting, and that's not true value engineering, but looking at it holistically, including ecological costs and impacts and benefits, as well as maintenance costs, impacts, and benefits, and applying that to your project and starting from there. So I think it gets to the start small, get a success within a reasonable time frame, like a year, 18 months, and then use that as the cause to scale up. And then of course, everyone else is doing it often persuades people. So say, hey, transportation is going to get all the funding if we don't start doing this.
Money does end up being the main decision maker a lot of times, unfortunately. Well, Chris, I want to thank you very much for your time and, you know, just helping us tip our toes into this broad topic, but very important topic, especially moving into future budget constraints and future considerations that we all really need to be impacted by. In closing, is there anything you would like to say?
Yeah, don't be afraid. You know, if you're already practicing this, great. Also, don't be afraid to reach out to me. I'm serious. You know, I like keeping up the discussions. I learn something new every day too. So don't be afraid to reach out to me. So thank you. Thank you for the opportunity, BK.
Well, everyone participating, I see people dropping off because we are hitting that hour shift time here. So I want to thank you for your participation. I will be sharing the recording with everyone. Please reach out to me. I've put a few links in there so you can check out more of what we've put out, and you can see some of our future shop talks that we will be putting together. And we look forward to hosting you again in the future. Thank you.
Take care.